Today, we're walking straight into those cells, through newspaper archives, courtroom testimonies, and cold forensic evidence, to uncover the 12 most dangerous women currently locked up in Australian prisons. Some of them killed once, others multiple times, and the reasons behind their crimes are darker than you might expect. Who were these women before the headlines? What pushed them to commit the unthinkable? And more importantly, do they regret it? Or would they do it again? Make sure you stay till the end, because the final case, it's one the government tried to silence for years. Before we jump in, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? And if you love deep dives into true crime cases they don't show on the news, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because we've got some shocking ones coming up next. Catherine Burney. It was late October in 1986 when police officers in Perth received a call that would quietly open the door to one of Australia's most disturbing serial crime cases. A young woman had just fled a suburban home in Willoughby, barefoot, her wrists still bound in handcuffs. She had knocked on a neighbor's door, panicked and shaking. The residents called police immediately. She said she had been kidnapped, and she wasn't the only one. What followed was a slow, methodical unraveling of events that would eventually reveal a horrifying series of crimes committed by a couple, and not just any couple, but a woman and man who blended into the community, who passed by unnoticed. Their names were Catherine Burney and David Burney. Together, they had abducted, violated, and unalived 4 women, and were planning on taking more. Catherine Burney did not look like a predator. She was quiet, almost reserved. A small woman, intelligent, composed, and in public often unnoticed. Born in 1951, Catherine's childhood was marked by disruption. Her mother passed away when she was just 2, and she was sent to live with relatives before returning to her father at age 10. Those who knew her growing up described her as serious, sometimes withdrawn. In her teenage years, she met David Burney, a boy 2 years older with a troubled background and a fascination with violence. The two formed a relationship early on, one that was both intense and toxic. When David went to prison in his 20s, Catherine married someone else and had 7 children. But when David was released in the early 80s, Catherine left her husband and returned to him. From that point forward, her identity would be fused with his, in life and in infamy. They lived together in a small house at 3 Morehouse Street in Willoughby. To outsiders, nothing seemed out of place. But inside that house, a pattern of planning, abduction, and violence had already begun. Their first known victim was Mary Nielsen, a 22-year-old university student. She had gone to the Burney house in October 1986, responding to an advertisement for cheap car tires. David lured her in. Catherine helped restrain her. She was held captive, harmed, and ultimately unalived. They buried her body in a shallow grave in Glen Eagle State Forest. Only days later, they abducted Susanna Candy, a bright 15-year-old schoolgirl who was walking home from a friend's house in Claremont. This time, the psychological torment was prolonged. Susanna was kept alive for days, subjected to cruelty and control. Catherine later confessed to giving David the signal to end her life after he failed to do it the first time. 2 more victims followed in quick succession. Noelene Patterson, a 31-year-old woman whose car had broken down, and Denise Brown, a 21-year-old who had just finished work late one night. Each victim followed the same pattern: lured, abducted, held, harmed, then unalived. Their bodies were all buried in the same isolated forest location. The method was mechanical, efficient. Catherine was not just a passive observer. She was an active participant. She prepared the space, bound the victims, and in some cases, even took part in the ending of their lives. There was no break, no remorse. Their plan was to kill a 5th, and possibly more. On November 10, 1986, they picked up Kate Moyer, a 17-year-old girl who had missed her bus home. She was hitchhiking when David pulled up. Catherine sat quietly in the passenger seat. Within minutes, Kate was overpowered and taken to the house in Willoughby, But Kate was observant. She remembered details, street names, the make of the car, the layout of the home. She stayed calm, even as they chained her to the bed. In the early morning hours, while Catherine was out of the room and David was distracted, Kate found a moment. She slipped out of the house, still bound, and ran. The neighbors took her in. Her escape, and her memory, saved countless lives. When police arrived at the Burney house, they found Kate's belongings still there, along with rope, chains, and other physical evidence. Catherine initially denied everything, but faced with Kate's detailed account, the evidence, and eventually David's confession, Catherine admitted to her role. In custody, she was cold, clinical. There were no tears, no apologies. When asked about the murders, she gave facts, not feelings. Catherine Burney was not someone with a long criminal history. She wasn't a woman living in poverty or desperation. Psychiatrists who assessed her after arrest struggled to fully define her. Some described her as deeply submissive, molded by a violent partner. Others said she shared a similar dark impulse, but was more methodical in hiding it. What's known is that she was not a victim of David. She was not coerced. Multiple reports concluded that she participated willingly and fully, and in some cases seemed to initiate the violence. Some theorized that Catherine saw the crimes as a way to maintain her bond with David. She feared losing him, and their twisted dynamic depended on shared secrecy and brutality. There was no mental illness diagnosis that explained it all, just a quiet kind of evil, organized, contained, and deeply embedded. Both Catherine and David Burney were sentenced to life imprisonment in 1987 with strict non-parole terms. In David's case, he took his own life in 2005 inside Casuarina prison. He left no note. Catherine remained in prison. Over the years, she applied for parole multiple times. All were denied. Each attempt reignited trauma for the victims' families. One judge remarked that she represented an ongoing risk to the community and showed no genuine remorse. Today, she is incarcerated at Bandyup Women's Prison in Western Australia. She is in her 70s now, a quiet inmate, rarely speaking to others. Still, every few years, her name reemerges as parole boards review, consider, then reject her release. What makes the case of Catherine Burney so deeply unsettling is not just the horror of the crimes, but the coldness with which they were carried out. She was not desperate. She was not out of control. She was methodical, calculating, calm. It's easy to imagine evil as loud, messy, or visibly unstable, but sometimes it wears a quiet face, sometimes it blends in, and sometimes it calls itself love. Gemma Lilly and Trudy Lennon. On the morning of June 13, 2016, a 17-year-old boy named Aaron Pagich failed to return home after telling his family he was meeting a friend at a local shopping center in Mandurah, a coastal town just south of Perth. Aaron was a quiet teenager. He had autism and lived a structured, predictable life. He was rarely late and never wandered off. So when he didn't come home that day and didn't respond to calls or texts, his mother immediately felt something was wrong. She reported him missing within hours. For 2 weeks, police searched. They interviewed friends, checked CCTV footage, knocked on doors, and followed every trace. It wasn't until officers began reviewing footage outside the local Woolworths that they noticed something chilling. Aaron was last seen walking with an older woman. She had a calm demeanor, and he appeared to trust her. That woman was Trudy Lennon, and what police would soon uncover behind the walls of her suburban home would leave even seasoned detectives shaken. To the outside world, neither Trudy Lennon nor her housemate, Gemma Lilly, raised suspicion. Trudy was a 43-year-old single mother of 3. She lived in the quiet suburb of Orillia and was known at school pickup lines and in local Facebook parenting groups. Her life seemed unremarkable, split between domestic responsibilities and part-time jobs. Behind closed doors, however, she had an obsession with sadistic literature and dark role-play communities. In private chat rooms, she called herself a slave and gravitated toward violent online fantasies. Gemma Lilly was 25. British by birth, she had moved to Australia a few years earlier. She worked in a tattoo parlor and was heavily into horror fiction. But her obsession went far beyond fandom. She had written a graphic, self-published novel about a serial killer named SOS, and often spoke to friends about her desire to know what it felt like to unalive someone. The two women had met through online kink circles and had quickly become close. They shared fantasies, dark conversations, and gradually merged their private worlds into something far more dangerous. By 2016, Gemma was living in Trudy's home. The lines between their fantasies and reality were already blurring. Aaron Pajic wasn't someone you'd expect to be targeted. He was a gentle, trusting teenager. Diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, he thrived on routine and familiarity. He loved computers and video games, and he was careful about who he spent time with. But he also had a longing for friendship, and that made him vulnerable. Trudy had met Aaron briefly through one of her sons, who also had autism. She used that connection to build trust. On the day of the crime, she lured him to her home under the pretense of installing a new computer game. Once Aaron stepped inside that house, the door closed behind him. He would never walk out again. The plan had been in place for weeks. Gemma Lilly was obsessed with fulfilling what she called her life's ambition. She had told people, casually, that she wanted to unalive someone before she turned 26. The date was approaching. Inside the house, the two women had prepared a room lined with plastic sheeting. A tarp was laid on the floor. Knives had been cleaned, sharpened, and positioned nearby. The pair had even tested how long it would take to dig a grave in the backyard, covered by concrete slabs. According to court documents, once Aaron was inside, he was led into the kitchen and attacked from behind. Gemma was the first to stab him, repeatedly, while Trudy joined in, helping restrain him. Aaron tried to fight back, but the attack was swift and brutal. He was overpowered. When it was done, they cleaned the room, wrapped his body in plastic, and buried him under freshly laid concrete in the garden. They placed potted plants on top. The next day, Trudy picked up her kids from school. Gemma went back to work at the tattoo shop. What ultimately led police to them wasn't just the Woolworth CCTV, it was the pair's lack of caution. Detectives quickly discovered that Trudy had known Aaron and that her housemate had an online persona obsessed with serial murder. They obtained a search warrant. Inside the home, they found bleach, gloves, and cleaning supplies in strange places. The backyard showed signs of recent digging. Forensics later confirmed that Aaron's blood had been found on the carpet and walls, despite attempts to clean it. Under the concrete, they discovered his body. The most disturbing discovery was in Gemma's bedroom. On the walls were posters of famous serial killers. Her notebooks were filled with violent sketches. Her self-published novel, Playzone, featured detailed accounts of torture and taking lives. Investigators later testified that she treated Aaron's killing like a box she had to tick, part of becoming her fictional alter ego, SOS. In court, the dynamic between Gemma Lilly and Trudy Lennon became clearer. Trudy was the submissive one, always seeking approval, always eager to please. She had followed Gemma's lead throughout, prosecutors said, but that didn't make her any less complicit. She had helped lure Aaron. She had helped restrain him. She had participated in the act. Gemma, on the other hand, showed little emotion. During police interviews, she denied involvement, but once evidence began to pile up, she stopped cooperating. At one point, she said simply, "It had to be done." Psychologists later described her as narcissistic and detached, but not clinically insane. She understood what she had done. She just didn't seem to care. In 2017, both women were found guilty of murder. The judge called it one of the most senseless crimes he had ever seen. Gemma Lilly and Trudy Lennon were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 28 years before parole eligibility. They are both incarcerated at Bandyup Women's Prison in Western Australia, the same facility as Catherine Burney. Since their imprisonment, both have been kept under close supervision. neither has shown significant remorse. According to prison sources, they are not allowed to associate with each other. Aaron's family, meanwhile, continues to grieve in silence. His mother, Sharon, has spoken only occasionally to the media, mostly to remember her son's love of music and his gentle spirit. The case of Gemma Lilly and Trudy Lennon is a stark reminder of how darkness doesn't always come with warning signs. These weren't women living on the fringes of society. They had jobs, they had families, they walked through shopping centers, went to work, laughed in public, all while planning a cold and deliberate crime. For Aaron Pejic, trust became a fatal vulnerability. He believed he was meeting a friend. Instead, he stepped into a carefully laid trap, designed by people who saw him not as a person, but as a means to fulfill a fantasy. Some crimes haunt us not because of their brutality, but because of how ordinary the perpetrators seemed, and how easily their masks held right until the end. Anu Singh. It was October 26, 1997, a quiet Sunday morning in Canberra. Emergency services received a call from a young woman at a modest home in the suburb of Downer. Her boyfriend, she said, wasn't breathing. When paramedics arrived, they found 26-year-old Joe Singh lying unresponsive in bed. His pupils were fixed, and there were no signs of life. But what struck investigators wasn't just the scene. It was the calm demeanor of the woman who had made the call. Her name was Anu Singh. She was composed, almost detached. And the inconsistencies began almost immediately. There were no signs of a struggle, no injuries typical of sudden cardiac arrest, and yet something felt disturbingly out of place. The truth, as it turned out, was far darker than anyone initially imagined. On paper, Anu Singh seemed like a woman on the path to success. She was in her mid-20s, striking, articulate, and studying law at the Australian National University, one of the country's most prestigious institutions. Her background was academic, respectable. Her father, a physician. Her mother, a professor. Singh had grown up surrounded by expectations of brilliance and discipline. To her classmates, she appeared driven, although often aloof. To some, she seemed to be spiraling, grappling with self-image, insecurity, and control. But few could have imagined what was brewing beneath the surface. Joe Singh, on the other hand, was kind, soft-spoken, and widely liked. A civil engineering graduate, Joe came from a close-knit Italian-Australian family in Newcastle. He met Anu at a university function. What started as a whirlwind romance soon grew into a serious relationship, but friends noticed something changing. Joe became more isolated, more deferential. Anu's control over the relationship was evident. What he ate, where he went, who he spoke to. Many assumed it was just a dominant personality at play. But for Joe, the cost of that dynamic would become fatal. In the weeks leading up to Joe's death, Anu Singh began expressing a chilling idea to those close to her. That she was dying, that something was wrong with her body, and that she couldn't live without taking Joe with her. She spoke of ending her life, but not just hers. She wanted Joe to die with her. She told this to multiple people, including a close friend and fellow law student, Madhavi Rao. They discussed it repeatedly, over coffee, in lectures, at home. The conversations didn't stay hypothetical. Singh began planning. She obtained Rohypnol, a sedative, and heroin, despite having no background in drug use. She had no apparent medical need, no recreational interest. The only purpose was lethal. On the night of October 25, 1997, Singh cooked dinner for Joe, his favorite pasta. She laced his drink with Rohypnol. Later, while he was heavily sedated, she injected him with heroin. It was the second time in 2 days. This time he didn't wake up. But perhaps the most disturbing part? Joe had no idea what was coming. The most haunting detail in this case isn't just Singh's actions, but what others knew and didn't do. Singh had made no secret of her plans. She had even scheduled what she called a farewell party for the night before the crime. Guests were invited. Food was served. Some attendees later said they thought the farewell was symbolic, a cry for help, but others knew the meaning behind it. Her friend, Madhavi Rao, was in the house the night Joe died. She helped obtain the heroin. She watched Singh inject him. Yet neither woman called for help until Joe was already gone. When police investigated, they found letters and diary entries from Singh expressing her desire to end both their lives. She had rehearsed the act in writing, refined the method, scheduled the timeline. And even after Joe's death, she was dispassionate, cold. She asked officers if she was under arrest. She seemed more concerned with her own legal outcome than with the life that had been lost. In court, Anu Singh's defense centered around mental illness. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, narcissistic traits, and psychotic depression. The argument was that she was so deluded, so wrapped in her own perceived physical decline, that she believed the act was merciful. But prosecutors didn't agree. They argued that Singh knew exactly what she was doing, that she had planned the crime for weeks, told people about it, and carried it out with chilling precision. The sedative in Joe's system, the injection, the delay in seeking help, these were not impulsive acts. In 1999, Singh was convicted, not of murder, but of manslaughter. The court accepted her diminished responsibility due to mental illness. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison with a non-parole period of 4 years. Many, especially Joe's grieving family, were devastated by the verdict. They believed justice had not been served. Edward Singh was released on parole in 2001 after serving just 4 years behind bars. One lesser-known aspect of the case is the role of university circles. Multiple students knew something was off. Some were directly told of Singh's plan. A few believed she might actually go through with it, but no one intervened. Even Madhavi Rao, who was charged as an accessory to manslaughter and later acquitted, did not call police, did not stop the act, and stayed silent until after Joe was gone. This wasn't just a story of one woman's dissent. It was a tragic case of bystander silence. After her release, Singh attempted to rebuild her life. She pursued a PhD in criminology and has made public statements reflecting on her actions. Some have seen this as accountability. Others view it as self-serving. Joe Sinque's family, particularly his mother Maria, has remained vocal. In 2004, she published a book, Joe Sinque's Consolation, detailing the years of grief and injustice they endured. That book was later adapted into a film in 2016, bringing the story back into public conversation. But no adaptation, no courtroom testimony, no parole condition can ever return what was lost. Joe was a young man with no history of violence, no warning signs, no reason to die. He trusted someone deeply, and that trust was used as a weapon. Anu Singh served her sentence at the Malawa Correctional Center, now part of the Silverwater Women's Correctional Center in New South Wales. She was released in October 2001, having served just 4 years of her sentence. Today, she lives under a new name and has occasionally spoken about mental illness and rehabilitation. But for many, the case remains unresolved, not in terms of the law, but in the quiet questions it leaves behind. Sometimes, the most devastating crimes don't happen in dark alleys or under violent confrontation. Sometimes, they happen at dies, an honor, at home, in silence. Joe Sinque died not in fear, but in trust. He believed he was safe. He believed he was loved. And in the end, that trust is what was taken from him first. It was May 1908, on a quiet morning in Perth, Western Australia. Neighbours noted an uneasy stillness drifting around the home at Parry Street, Bunbury. Inside, 2 young girls lay lifeless in their beds. The elder, Annie, appeared to have struggled. The younger, Rose, quietly inhaled. No sign of external injury, nothing to suggest the source of tragedy. The local physician called to the scene suspected something insidious. It would soon become clear. These were not natural deaths. This was the beginning of one of the most chilling cases in Western Australia's history. To the neighbours, Martha Rendell was a quiet, unassuming woman in her 30s, stepping into a role as caregiver and guardian. She lived with her de facto partner, William Rendell, a widower with several children. In public, Martha seemed diligent and compliant, a woman filling a domestic need, caring for the boys and occasionally doting on the youngest, Annie and Rose. Children seemed to respond to her presence. Servants and townsfolk described her as even-tempered and mild-mannered. No one suspected that beneath that composed appearance lay something far darker. Martha had no biological connection to Annie and Rose. They were William's daughters from his previous marriage. Yet she had taken on the role of stepmother. In a household with limited supervision and a growing sense of isolation, her influence over the children was unprecedented. The girls, ages just 5 and 3, trusted her. That trust would prove fatal. The first death was subtle. In January 1908, William found Annie unresponsive. Symptoms mimicked a sudden illness, difficulty breathing, coughing. She was buried hastily, thought to have succumbed to diphtheria or pneumonia. A few weeks later, Rose followed. This time, details were less clear. Whispered to be a lingering fever. William and others were unaware of the pattern forming beneath their roof. It wasn't until May that a neighboring doctor raised concern. 2 deaths in one household, but suspiciously smooth. No external illness markers. No epidemic. Under pressure, local authorities ordered an autopsy on Rose. Something in the deeper inspection, a residue in the lungs, set alarm bells off. Once suspicions were confirmed, police conducted a search of the house. They discovered bottles of parasite tinctures labeled innocuously. A neighbor revealed Martha had frequently administered these to the children, claiming it was a remedy for worms. The same neighbor noted once, in private, she expressed frustration quietly, that the children often made trouble and suggested she needed some peace. Scientists tested the tinctures. They contained concentrated hydrochloric acid, a potent poison when misused. The medicines were not benign, they were lethal. When questioned, Martha maintained innocence. She insisted she had only tried to help the children. She presented as reasonable, calm, remorseful. And yet the evidence told a different story. Martha's motive remains opaque. There was no insurance money, no apparent financial or material gain. The Rendell household was modest, without lavish assets. Speculation at the time pointed toward Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where a caregiver causes illness in a person under their care to draw attention or sympathy. But Brian Smith, a historian who later studied the case, proposed another theory: repressed resentment, a desire to control, to relieve herself of those she saw as burdensome. The children were young, needy, and sometimes difficult. In an era with no formal adoption or safeguarding systems, Martha may have felt trapped. Whether she believed her acts merciful or merely necessary cannot be confirmed in writing. Courtroom testimony revealed she had written letters requesting time alone, expressing weariness. Yet she never admitted intent. She never confessed. She offered only sorrow. In July 1908, Martha Rendell stood trial for the murder of Annie. The prosecution laid out compelling evidence: the acid-laced tincture, the medical reports, the rapid sequence of deaths. Witnesses recounted how Martha administered the drops, watched their condition decline, and withheld alarm. Her defense argued innocence, suggesting the tincture was misunderstood medicine. But the jury deliberated for less than an hour. She was convicted of murder. At the sentencing, Judge Hartland spoke solemnly. "It is rare, but we must acknowledge, this is not only a crime, it is a betrayal of the most innocent." By law, she was sentenced to death. There was no appeal. On the morning of February 4, 1909, Martha Rendell stood at the gallows in the Perth jail, the only woman ever legally executed in Western Australia. Her appearance remained composed. There were no screams, no breakdown, just a quiet walker toward the noose. Her final moment was brief, carried out under official gaze. No last words were recorded. Afterwards, the street outside the jail was silent, almost reverent. The community had every reason to think they knew her, but they were wrong. Martha Rendell did not fit the profile of a monster. She was gentle on the surface, ordinary in her routines. Loving, at least she played that role. She filled the space around William that grief had left vacant. Yet she weaponized that role against those most vulnerable. Annie and Rose died under her care, in silence. Maybe she saw death as release, or maybe she just saw an escape for herself. But the truth is this: trust shielded her, familiarity hidden her, and access gave her the means. When we reflect on the case today, it reminds us how easily the moments in homes can conceal horrors, how evil sometimes lives in the smallest pills, syrupy lies, and daily routines. Martha Rendell was executed by hanging at the Perth jail on February 4, 1909. She received no sentence of incarceration. Her law permitted only capital punishment. This case lingers, not because of its drama, but because of its quiet betrayal. The stillness that followed the crime is still there, beyond century-old records, echoing in our unease. Harriet Ann Stevens and 19th-century baby farmers. It was the late 1880s, across disparate corners of eastern Australia, quiet suburban homes and modest townhouses filled with young children, whispers of illness and unexplained grief. In each home, a mother figure tended to the sick, comforted the bereaved, and buried those who didn't recover. At the time, these deaths seemed private, unremarkable. But as records and suspicions grew, a disturbing pattern emerged: women entrusted with infant lives, who, under the guise of care, completed them. Harriet Ann Stevens, active around 1886, was a woman known in her district as polite and responsible. She offered to care for infants whose mothers could not, working quietly, taking payments, and offering solace to struggling families. She seemed like a neighborly fixture. Louisa Collins, active until 1888, lived in Botany, Sydney. A mother of 10, she was regarded by many as overwhelmed but steadfast. She nursed 2 husbands through illness, and though neighbors noted certain oddities, she retained an air of respectability. Her calm demeanor and tears of grief made her a figure both pitied and trusted. Sarah Jane Macon, who began baby farming after her husband was injured, appeared as a midwife or caregiver. In the community, she and her husband, John Macon, were seen as helpers, responding to desperate calls from unmarried mothers overwhelmed by impossible circumstances. None of these women were biological mothers to all the children they cared for. They were paid to take in infants, often unnamed or illegitimate, under social and financial pressure. Harriet Ann Stevens accepted infants in need, including at least 2 who died while in her care. Louisa Collins took on the role of caretaker in her home, for her husband's, stepchildren, and her own child, before suspicion fell on her when both husbands and her child died. The Macons, too, infants entrusted to them, removing them from their mothers with promises of care, only for those children to vanish without trace. With Stevens, reports indicate 2 infants died in her care in 1886, and 1 survived a suspicious illness. Newspapers of the time mention a quiet unease, though no formal investigation took shape. Her reputation softened the suspicion. In Louisa Collins's case, her first husband, Charles Andrews, fell ill and died after months of stomach distress. Several years later, her second husband, Michael Collins, suffered the same unexplained symptoms and died. Soon after, her own child died as well. It wasn't until the pervasive attention in the press and the revelation that she kept a box of rough-on rats, an arsenic-based poison, in her house that authorities began to act. For the Macons, the pattern unfolded when digging in yards where they had lived uncovered infant remains, 7 at Burren Street, and ultimately 13 bodies across multiple properties. The causes were unclear, but suspicion turned to their practice of baby farming. The infants weren't returned to families, and too many simply disappeared. Louisa Collins was tried 4 times for her second husband's death. 3 juries deadlocked before a 4th delivered a guilty verdict. Her own 10-year-old daughter testified about the poison found in their home. Despite minimal direct evidence or clear motive, she was sentenced to death by hanging in January 1889, becoming the last woman executed in New South Wales. The hanging was severely mishandled. Accounts describe delays in the gallows mechanism and a spurt of blood, marking a gruesome end. John and Sarah Macon were convicted in 1893, chiefly for the murder of baby Horace Murray, though others were suspected. John was hanged in August 1893. Sarah's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She was eventually released to her daughter's custody in 1911, dying in 1918 after decades of confinement. Harriet Ann Stevens' case remains less documented, though she was linked to at least 2 murders and 1 attempted murder in 1886. Official records are sparse and public memories faded. She embodies the many cases barely uncovered, quietly swept under the societal rug of the time. Louise's motives are still debated. Some suggest insurance and financial desperation, others point to a desire for attention or sympathy from grieving. She never confessed and claimed innocence until her death, even penning a plea for mercy the night before her hanging. Sarah Macon's actions may have been driven by financial pressures. The Macons operated amid shame and poverty, and women faced minimal support for illegitimate infants. Still the scale, 13 bodies, points beyond neglect toward deliberate and cold decisions. With Harriet Ann Stevens, little is known of her inner life. She remains a ghost in history, a reminder of how many cases went undetermined, unprosecuted, unremembered. These women, Harriet Ann Stevens, Louisa Collins, Sarah Jane, and John Macon, were never monsters. In garish costumes, they were ordinary women navigating extraordinary social constraints. They performed expected roles: caretaker, mother, not quite stepmother. The trust placed in them shielded darker impulses. They knew how to make others let down their guard. And when they chose to end those lives, they did so in darkness, without spectacle, away from the public eye. Their stories linger because they undo our assumptions about love and motherhood. They show how love, trust, and grief can be twisted into something unthinkable. Harriet Ann Stevens remains largely undocumented in terms of punishment. Her estimated crimes in 1886 have left no clear prison record. Louisa Collins was executed by hanging at Darlinghurst Gaol on 8th of January 1889. She is remembered as the last woman executed in New South Wales. Sarah Jane Macon spent nearly 2 decades behind bars across multiple institutions: Darlinghurst, Bathurst, and Long Bay. She was released in 1911 after 18 years, due to age and ill health, and died in 1918. This case endures, not through sensationalism, but through its quiet betrayal. Lives entrusted and extinguished in seeming normalcy. The softest touch sometimes conceals the sharpest blade. Erin Patterson. It was 29 July 2023, a mild winter day in Leongatha, Victoria. Erin Patterson hosted lunch at her freshly built 2-story home, nestled among gum trees and native flora. A seemingly ordinary gathering. Beef Wellington for 4 guests, her estranged husband's parents, Don and Gail Patterson, and Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, with her husband Ian. Within 24 hours, all 4 were hospitalized with severe gastrointestinal symptoms. By early August, 3 had died, and 1 remained critically injured. That afternoon's serenity became the center of a growing nightmare. Outside the courtroom and beyond the headlines, Erin Patterson presented as a meticulous homemaker and devoted mother. She had taken time off work to raise her 2 children and had plans to begin nursing and midwifery studies. On Facebook, she participated in true crime discussion groups, sharing careful observations and empathies with other armchair investigators. Neighbors viewed her as composed, hospitable, eager to maintain connections, even amid her separation from her husband. She seemed intent on rebuilding, or at least maintaining, a life of normalcy. The victims were close by blood and marriage. Don and Gail Patterson were her estranged husband Simon's parents. Heather Wilkinson was Gail's sister, and Ian Wilkinson, her husband. Erin invited them under the guise of reconciliation, yet their relationship had grown strained, marked by disagreements over child support and emotional distance. On that afternoon, Erin served carefully prepared individual beef Wellington pastries, mashed potatoes, and green beans. She invited Grace before the meal, maintaining a calm demeanor as her guests began to eat. By the next morning, all four were admitted to hospital with symptoms resembling severe gastroenteritis. Erin, too, reported illness, but repeatedly refused admission, discharging herself against the medical advice, even as doctors expressed concern over possible mushroom poisoning. The three relatives succumbed within days, while Ian Wilkinson survived after 7 weeks in intensive care. Authorities immediately suspected foul play. Forensic investigators uncovered death cap mushroom toxins in the beef Wellington and, critically, Erin's food dehydrator at a landfill, bearing her fingerprints and traces of the same mushrooms. Further evidence arrived. She had not surrendered her primary phone during the police search, but a factory reset dummy device, suggestive of deception. Prosecutors outlined a narrative built on deception. False cancer claims, intentional use of the death cap mushroom, self-inflicted illness performance, and orchestrated concealment. During the trial, Erin maintained the inclusion of death caps was an accident, a case of mixed mushrooms, some foraged, some store-bought, that she had stored and mistaken in the pantry. Identifying motive proved elusive. Prosecutors underscored the breakdown of her marriage and contention with her in-laws, but offered no definitive reason why she would kill them. Erin painted a different picture. Low self-esteem, shame over weight and appearance, fabricating a cancer diagnosis to mask plans for surgery. She claimed the lunch was meant to rebuild ties that were fracturing due to separation. Internet searches on death cap mushrooms were discovered on her computer, a detail that undercut claims of innocence. Her selective illness and plated differences, the guests on gray plates while she used a different one, also raised suspicion. In interviews, her estranged husband Simon was described by local community as warm and decent. He continues to cope with ongoing trauma, possibly planning to tell his version of events through a book or podcast. After a trial lasting over 9 weeks, the 12-member jury deliberated for 6 days before finding Patterson guilty on all counts, 3 murders and 1 attempted murder. She faces life imprisonment. With sentencing pending, her Leongatha home has been barred from sale to facilitated potential restitution. The Erin Patterson case unsettles not in spectacle, but in its hush. The ordinary act of preparing a meal transformed into a deliberate act of destruction. Trust became the entry point for violence. A mother, a host, a familiar face. There was no gruesome struggle here. There was only a table, a meal lovingly prepared, and lives entrusted that were extinguished. The unfolding showed how easily domestic spaces can harbor betrayal, how vulnerability can be silent, and how a veneer of normality may conceal the unimaginable. Erin Patterson is remanded at the Dame Phyllis Frost Center, Victoria's maximum security women's prison, as she awaits formal life sentencing. Susan Neal Fraser. It was Australia Day, 26th January 2009, along the peaceful waters of the River Derwent in Hobart, Tasmania. The yacht Four Winds, named for the winds that seemed to carry its story, lay moored off Sandy Bay. Her partner, Bob Chappell, a 65-year-old medical physicist, had been working aboard. At some point alone, for reasons unclear, he vanished. There were no witnesses, no struggle, no body, only a ship destined to sink, and a silence that invited suspicion. To many, Susan Neal Fraser was unremarkable. A longtime partner to Bob for nearly 18 years, she appeared reserved, considerate, content in a modest domestic life. She navigated marina visits and shore routines with ease. She offered nothing outwardly strange. When police descended, searching for answers, few expected what would emerge from behind that composed facade. Susan and Bob were partners in both home and hobby. The Four Winds was not just a vessel. It represented shared dreams and routines. He was the pragmatic expert, she the quiet presence at the edges. Their relationship was weathered by years, but not marred by overt conflict, at least none publicly acknowledged. So when Bob disappeared, the trust between them became the center of a case built on absence and inference. With Bob missing and the yacht found half submerged, investigators quickly developed a hypothesis. Susan had returned to the Four Winds later that evening, disposed of Bob's body into the river, and scuttled the yacht to hide evidence. Her statements to police shifted multiple times. First, she claimed she left the yacht for a trip to Bunnings. CCTV did not support this version. Then she said she stayed home all evening. Later, she claimed a stress-driven return to check on Bob. These inconsistencies form the backbone of a consciousness of guilt, a tapestry of shifting narratives that prosecutors presented to jurors. Physical evidence was nearly invisible. Bob's body never surfaced. No murder weapon was recovered. Investigators focused on forensic traces aboard the Four Winds: disrupted seams, a winch handle misplaced, a missing fire extinguisher, cut ropes, and a tampered seacock beneath concealed panels, delicate fixes requiring intimate knowledge of the vessel. Most alarming was the discovery of inexplicable DNA. A sample taken from a swab on the deck revealed a female profile unknown to authorities at the time, later linked to a homeless teenager, Megan Vass. She denied being aboard the yacht, but her DNA stood as silent, unexplained testimony. In October 2010, after 3 weeks of trial and 18 hours of deliberation, a jury returned a unanimous verdict. Susan Neal Fraser was convicted of murder, despite the absence of a body or weapon. She was sentenced to 26 years, with a non-parole period of 18 years. Justice Alan Blow condemned the act as deliberate and self-serving. She stood to gain more from Bob's death than separation. He deemed her lies not incidental, but strategic. For the court, the deliberate falsity and the actions aboard the yacht spoke louder than the missing body. Susan's appeals began swiftly but faltered. In 2012, the Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed her appeal. In 2014, a coroner affirmed the murder finding. She relaunched in 2016 under new Tasmanian law, seeking reconsideration based on fresh and compelling evidence. Her appeal hinged on Megan Vass's changing statements and DNA, and expert forensic challenges to luminol results and winching reconstructions. But in November 2021, the court dismissed the appeal. 2 judges found the evidence unconvincing. 1, Justice Estcourt, dissented, favoring retrial. She applied to the High Court in 2022. That too failed. All avenues closed until parole offered her release in October 2022 after serving 13 years. Upon her release, Susan remained under strict parole. Among other conditions, she was barred from speaking publicly about her innocence. Despite this, her supporters, the Neal Fraser Support Group, including her daughter Sarah, continue to call for an inquiry, citing perceived systemic failures and urging for truth beyond silence. No direct motive was ever established, no confession made. The prosecution suggested financial preference over separation. Some public voices argue she may be the victim of a miscarriage of justice, citing shaky forensic practices and untested alternative scenarios. Others maintain the suffocation of trust was deliberate. The uncertainty lingers. A community divided, a victory for one side becomes an open wound for another. Susan maintained her innocence every step, but the court constricted options to a silent truth. There are no triumphant reveals here, no hidden video, no confession, just empty water below a sunlit deck, a yacht left partially sunk, and the absence of one man's body. It is the silence that persists, the void where answers should lie. Susan Neal Fraser walked away after 13 years. Her guilt remains legally affirmed, yet emotionally unresolved for many. And the waters of the Derwent carry both her freedom and the grief of those who lost Bob, in a place where truth and loss drift without conclusion. Susan Neal Fraser was sentenced in 2010 to 26 years imprisonment, later reduced to 23 years with a non-parole period of 13 years. She was released on parole in October 2022. Belinda Colbran. It was a quiet evening in Newnham, Tasmania, in mid-2016. At the home of 22-year-old Aaron Monaco, a knock on the door changed everything. Aaron answered, and within moments, he was stabbed multiple times. His injuries were grave enough that he stumbled to a neighbor's door, drenched in blood. First responders arrived. It was clear Aaron had been brutally attacked. Despite their efforts, he was pronounced dead. That night would mark the beginning of a case that stunned a community. To those who knew her, Belinda Leon Colbran appeared ordinary. She was known locally, living with her partner Nathan Smith. She wasn't in the limelight. She was quiet, affectionate, perhaps easily overlooked. There was no public sign that she'd become central to a violent crime. Aaron Monaco and Belinda knew each other, though not intimately. Their lives crossed through social circles in Launceston and Newnham. Belinda's partner, Nathan Smith, was also part of the periphery. It wasn't a romantic entanglement, but the nature of their connection would become a critical thread in the investigation. In the courtroom, prosecutors laid out the case with precision. Aaron had been stabbed 6 times. The attack was not random. It was violent and up close. Evidence pointed to a connection with Belinda and Nathan. The two were arrested and charged with Aaron's murder. CCTV footage, phone records, and forensic clues began to map a chronology of movements and interactions that placed both individuals under scrutiny. In court, Belinda smiled briefly at her partner before sentencing, an image that later haunted observers. In December 2018, the Launceston Supreme Court reached its verdict. Both Belinda Colbran and Nathan Thomas Smith were found guilty of murdering Aaron Monaco. They were each sentenced to 24 years in prison with eligibility for parole after serving 13 years. Belinda confirmed she would not pursue an appeal, finalizing the case against her. The judge referenced the severity and meant the act as callous. Aaron's sister delivered an impact statement, words soaked with grief, the quiet fury of a life senselessly ended. Details remain sparse when it comes to deeper motive. There was no public confession, no notes, no financial gain cited. Neither woman spoke of what drove them that night. The court emphasized the brutality of the act. Aaron's life ended abruptly, surrounded by betrayal. Some observers speculated on emotional or personal dynamics, tensions, disputes, unresolved conflicts, but the evidence presented remained physical and procedural, not psychological. Belinda never offered public testimony on why. The courtroom held its peace. The questions linger quietly. The most unsettling part of this case lies not in dramatic gestures or spectacle, but in how trust was fractured in an ordinary exchange. A knock on a door, a moment between neighbors, and in seconds, a life was taken. Belinda Colbran was someone many would not have watched closely, yet her role in this crime reminds us how proximity can obscure danger. A neighbor, a familiar face, someone blending into the quiet backdrop of daily life. This is a story of absence, not just of life, but of explanation. Aaron Monaco is gone, and with that disappearance, the chance for truth dimmed. Belinda Colbran is serving a 24-year prison sentence, with parole possible after 13 years, in a Tasmanian facility. Her release, if it comes, will come as one of many unspoken conclusions. But for Aaron's family, and for a community, the quiet void she leaves behind will remain, unresolved, uncomfortably open. Inside that room, the lifeless body of 73-year-old bookmaker William Pop Kent was found slumped and brutalized. His face was barely recognizable. His limbs bore signs of torture, and the truth that slowly unraveled in the days that followed would lead to the last woman ever executed in Australia, a woman named Jean Lee. Born as Marjorie Jean Maud Wright in 1919 in suburban Sydney, she came from a modest, working-class background. She was intelligent, articulate, and grew up dreaming of a stable life. For a time she worked as a typist, wore her hair curled neatly, and appeared, at least to neighbors and acquaintances, like any other young woman trying to make her way through wartime Australia. But underneath the surface, Jean's life was unraveling. She fell into sex work in her 20s, often working out of cheap boarding houses. She met Norman Andrews, a man with a long criminal history, and their relationship quickly turned volatile. Then came Robert David Clayton, a drifter with a violent streak and no moral compass. Together, the three formed a dysfunctional and dangerous triangle, one that would turn fatal. William Pop Kent was well known in Melbourne's underworld, not as a gangster, but as a quiet, elderly bookmaker who mostly kept to himself. He dealt in bets, owed and paid debts, and had a reputation for keeping large amounts of cash close by. That reputation would cost him his life. Jean Lee was arrested just days later. She confessed quickly, almost too easily, though she later claimed she'd been manipulated by Clayton and Andrews. At trial, Jean appeared small, pale, and frightened. She wept in the dock. The public, however, wasn't sympathetic. In post-war Australia, the notion of a woman involved in such sadistic violence shook moral foundations. Women were meant to nurture, to care. Jean had participated in torture. The trial lasted only 8 days. All 3 were found guilty of murder. But it was Jean's sentence that ignited a national debate. She would become the first, and ultimately the last, woman to be executed in Australia. Behind prison walls, Jean's story became more complicated. In her final months at Pentridge Prison in Victoria, Jean reportedly became deeply religious. She read the Bible daily. She corresponded with a journalist named Jill Reich, one of the few people who believed Jean had been exploited and deserved mercy. There were growing calls for clemency. Even church leaders pleaded for her life to be spared. But the Victorian government refused to intervene. On February 19, 1951, Jean Lee was led to the gallows. She was just 31 years old. It was 8:00 a.m. The executioner was a man known only by the pseudonym Thomas Pierpoint. Jean reportedly walked calmly, refusing sedatives. Her last words were never recorded. She died alongside her 2 co-accused, Andrews and Clayton, in separate executions on the same morning. But it was Jean's death that reverberated across the country, because she was a woman, and because she was the last. Today, Jean Lee's case exists in a strange place, somewhere between history, myth, and cautionary tale. There are those who see her as a brutal criminal, a woman who chose violence and never deserved mercy. Others see her as a product of neglect and abuse, a woman manipulated by the men in her life and swept into a crime she couldn't stop. Some believe she was punished not just for murder, but for defying the roles society had carved out for women in the 1940s. What's clear is this: Jean Lee was not insane. She was not possessed. She wasn't the femme fatale the newspapers made her out to be. She was a real woman, born into hardship, hardened by a world that showed her little kindness, and ultimately led to a violent end, both for her victim and for herself. Jean was buried in an unmarked grave in Coburg Cemetery, Victoria. Over time, her name faded from headlines, but her story remains in the annals of Australian crime, not because she was the most dangerous, or even the most cruel, but because she marked the end of something. After Jean, Australia would never again carry out the death penalty on a woman, and less than 2 decades later, the country would abolish capital punishment altogether. The haunting weight of her execution was perhaps a turning point, a final acknowledgement that killing, even by the state, doesn't always bring justice. Sometimes it only deepens the wound. Jean Lee, the last woman to die by the rope in Australia. A mother, a sex worker, an accomplice to murder, and a name that still echoes in the quiet halls of Pentridge Prison long after the gallows were dismantled. Jean Lee was held at Pentridge Prison in Melbourne. She was executed on February 19, 1951, alongside her co-accused. Her sentence was capital punishment, the final instance of a woman being legally executed in Australian history. Natalie Maher. It was early 2019 in Sandy Bay, an affluent suburb in Hobart, Tasmania, the kind of place that feels shielded from tragedy. But inside a quiet home tucked among tree-lined streets, police made a devastating discovery. Veronica Korstorfine, a 71-year-old mother, was found unresponsive in her bedroom. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. At first glance, it didn't look like a violent crime scene, but within hours, suspicion would turn toward the person closest to her. Her daughter, Natalie Maher, had made the call. She was calm. Too calm, investigators would later note. And as detectives began to peel back the layers, they realized something chilling. This wasn't a random act. It wasn't about money. It was about something far more personal. To those who knew her, Natalie Maher was intelligent, articulate, and fiercely private. In her mid-40s, she'd never married. She lived with her mother in the family home, something that, while unusual at her age, was explained away by her role as Veronica's carer. Natalie had studied law. She was educated, capable, and, by all appearances, a devoted daughter. Neighbors described her as quiet and reserved, never hostile, never emotional. She was the type of person who faded into the background, not one who would make headlines. But behind closed doors, Natalie's world was collapsing, and no one saw it. Veronica Korstorfin had lived a long life. She was active in her church, known for her charitable work, and had been widowed years earlier. Her relationship with Natalie, while outwardly stable, was complex. The two women lived under the same roof. Natalie was not just Veronica's daughter. She was her full-time carer. Over the years, as Veronica's health declined, Natalie took on more and more responsibility, and slowly that sense of duty began to twist into something else. By the time police began their interviews, a portrait had emerged, not of abuse or neglect, but of exhaustion, resentment, a quiet erosion of the line between love and obligation. On the morning police arrived, Natalie told them her mother had passed away during the night. She claimed it had been peaceful, but inconsistencies in her story began to emerge quickly. The autopsy revealed that Veronica had been smothered, a deliberate act. There were no defensive wounds, no struggle. This wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated and quiet. Under questioning, Natalie cracked. She confessed to smothering her mother with a pillow as she lay in bed. The words came without emotion, no hysteria, no plea for understanding. Just facts, calmly delivered. She admitted that her mother's declining health had left her feeling trapped, that she'd felt isolated, that she saw no end to the constant care. And one night, as Veronica lay asleep, Natalie made a decision. She took her mother's life. This wasn't a case driven by greed or violence. There was no history of mistreatment or hostility. Natalie didn't try to hide the crime, nor did she make any attempt to flee. Instead, what emerged was a devastating portrait of emotional decay, of a woman who had, over years, lost her sense of self beneath the weight of responsibility. Friends would later testify that Natalie had become withdrawn, that she hadn't taken a holiday in over a decade, that she rarely left the house. She wasn't a monster, but she had become numb, and in that numbness, she crossed a line she could never return from. In 2019, Natalie Maher was charged with the murder of her mother. The court proceedings were brief. There was no need for a lengthy trial. Natalie pleaded guilty. There was no attempt to blame anyone else. During sentencing, the judge spoke quietly but firmly. He acknowledged Natalie's clean record, her dedication to caring for Veronica, but he also pointed to the severity of the act, a violation of trust so complete that no circumstance could fully justify it. Natalie was sentenced to 23 years in prison with a non-parole period of 13 years. There were no televised interviews, no memoirs. Natalie Maher disappeared from public view just as quietly as she had lived. Her name joined the short, unsettling list of women in Tasmania who had committed matricide, a rare and deeply disturbing act. There was no legacy left behind. No letters, no diary, nothing to explain why it had to end this way. For many, that silence is the hardest part, because it leaves behind not just grief, but a quiet confusion. How could someone who appeared so normal, so reliable, do something so final? Natalie Maher didn't fit the profile of a killer. She didn't lash out in anger. She didn't lose control. Instead, she made a conscious decision to end her mother's life. And then she went to sleep. It's a reminder of how invisible emotional breakdown can be, how some of the deepest despair shows no outward signs. Natalie never asked for help. She never told anyone she was struggling. And so, no one intervened. Some crimes echo with noise and chaos. This one does not. It lingers in silence. A quiet room in a quiet house, where something irreversible happened. Today, Natalie Maher is incarcerated in Tasmania, likely at the Mary Hutchinson Women's Prison. She will serve at least 13 years before being eligible for parole. At her current age, release would come when she is in her late 50s, if it comes at all. There have been no appeals, no further statements, only the quiet passing of time inside a prison wall. This was not a story of evil. It was a story of collapse, of what can happen when someone is left alone for too long with too much weight on their shoulders. Natalie Marr took the life of the person who gave her life, and there are no easy words to make sense of that. But perhaps the question isn't just how this happened, but how many others are walking the edge, quietly, unseen. It was early morning on May 23, 2009, in the quiet town of Lauderdale, Tasmania. The day began like any other, cool air rolling off Frederick Henry Bay, a stillness in the streets that felt almost sacred. But by the time the sun had fully risen, everything had changed. Police were called to a driveway on a suburban street where the lifeless body of a man had been found slumped near his car. He had been shot multiple times. His name was Shane Michael Barker, 45 years old, a father, and former son-in-law to the woman who would later stand accused of taking part in his murder. Her name was Noelene June Jordan. To those who knew her on the surface, Noelene was the image of a conservative, church-going woman. At 68, she lived with her husband in a modest home in Tasmania and kept mostly to herself. Neighbors described her as quiet, polite, and devout. She had no criminal record, no violent history. It was difficult for many to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the shocking reality that would soon unfold in court. Because the victim, Shane Barker, was not just some stranger. He was the ex-husband of Noelene's daughter, and the family ties between them had long since frayed into something bitter, something dangerous. For years, tension had simmered between Shane and the Jordan family. His marriage to their daughter had ended badly, marked by accusations, resentment, and custody disputes over children. While no one could have predicted how far things would go, friends of the family told investigators that the animosity was thick, palpable. By 2009, things reached a boiling point. According to court records, Noelene and her husband Graham, Cedric Jordan, began plotting what prosecutors later described as a premeditated act. It wasn't a moment of rage. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was methodical. They purchased a firearm illegally. They monitored Shane, his movements. They chose the time and location. And then, in the early hours of that May morning, they ambushed him. Shane was preparing to drive to work when he was confronted in his own driveway. The Jordans were waiting for him. In a terrifying few seconds, multiple shots rang out. He tried to escape, but he never stood a chance. The fatal wounds ensured he wouldn't survive the attack. The Jordans fled the scene. For days, investigators were left trying to piece together what had happened, but it didn't take long for the truth to rise. The murder weapon was eventually recovered. Surveillance and witness accounts placed the Jordans near the crime scene. Forensic evidence linked them to the shooting. And when investigators dug deeper into their communications and behavior in the weeks prior, a clearer picture emerged. This wasn't random. This was personal. The motive, according to prosecutors, stemmed from a long history of hostility between Shane Barker and the Jordan family, specifically centered around allegations of past domestic tension and the belief that he had wronged their daughter. But rather than turn to the law or distance themselves, Noelene and Graham took justice into their own hands. The legal process took time. For over a decade, the case remained tangled in procedural delays and ongoing investigations. It wasn't until 2023, 14 years after the crime, that justice was finally delivered. By then, Noelene was 82 years old. Inside the courtroom, she sat quietly as the verdict was read. Guilty of murder. The judge described the crime as calculated and cold-blooded. She had been part of a joint plan to end a man's life, and she had followed through. The sentence was severe but not unexpected. Noelene June Jordan was sentenced to 22 years in prison with a non-parole period of 12 years. Her husband received the same. Given her age, many believe she may never leave prison alive. She is currently serving her sentence in Tasmania's Mary Hutchinson Women's Prison, an austere facility that houses some of the state's most high-profile female offenders. The story of Noelene June Jordan lingers for many reasons, not just because of the violence, but because of the transformation. Here was a woman who had lived most of her life without drawing attention, a woman who raised children, attended church, and seemed to keep within the bounds of a quiet, rural life. Yet underneath it all was a slow-burning fury, a sense of injustice, real or perceived, that eventually consumed her. It's a chilling reminder that the capacity for destruction doesn't always come from strangers or monsters in the shadows. Sometimes it comes from those who blend in, those who smile politely, those who sit at the dinner table and pray before meals. When a person crosses the line between feeling wronged and becoming judge, jury, and executioner, there is no return. And when that person is a grandmother, someone trusted by her family and community, the betrayal cuts even deeper. For Shane Barker, the father, the son, the former husband, his story ended violently in a driveway on a quiet street. But for those he left behind, the pain didn't stop there. It echoed through the years of legal limbo. It reverberated through the courtroom, and it continues quietly as Noelene lives out her days behind bars. A woman who once seemed ordinary, now marked by an irreversible choice. Annette Hancock. It was the night of March 9th, 2022, inside a modest social housing unit on Harrington Street, Hobart, Tasmania. Darkness settled quietly, broken only by the muted sounds of a city winding down for the evening. Inside the unit, a domestic disruption was about to end in tragedy. By the next morning, police had made a discovery. Benjamin Harris, aged 51, lay motionless, stabbed and unresponsive. The call to 000 had changed lives, rewriting familiar routines into echoes of loss. To the outside world, Annette Louise Ruth Hancock, aged 56, appeared unremarkable. She blended into her surroundings quietly, without fanfare. Records show a long history of personal struggle. Court documents noted prior breaches of a family violence order involving the victim, along with challenges related to housing and mental health. But she did not stand out. There were no news headlines, no run-ins with police over violence, until that night. Annette and Benjamin had been in a relationship for about 3 years. At the time of the incident, a family violence order legally restricted her from entering his home, but he had allowed her inside. Their relationship was fragile, fractured by alcohol dependency, emotional volatility, and trust broken by infidelity. It existed on the edge of conflict, and one evening, it crossed a line it could not return from. On the night in question, both Hancock and Harris had been drinking heavily. According to court records, a confrontation began when Harris admitted to infidelity, telling Annette that the woman he had been with was better than her. That statement triggered something profound. In a moment of anger, fueled by alcohol and emotion, Annette armed herself with a kitchen knife. Prosecutors allege she stabbed Harris in the back, the blade penetrating between his vertebrae to a depth of 13 centimeters. The force of the wound collapsed his lung and led to cardiac arrest from blood loss. Paramedics arrived but were too late. She remained at the scene and would later tell police in a recorded interview that she was drunk, had missed her medication, and never intended to kill him. In December 2024, a jury in Hobart Supreme Court found Annette Hancock guilty of murder. Despite her claims of a momentary lapse, the court relied on evidence of pre-existing family violence contraventions, the severity of the attack, and the breach of legal conditions. During sentencing, Justice Helen Wood described the incident as impulsive, yet deliberate. Hancock had internal turmoil, yes, but her actions caused a preventable death. The court heard that Hancock had been effectively homeless upon release from prison and depended on Harris for shelter. Justice Wood noted Hancock's long-standing mental health and substance use concerns, but affirmed that these did not reduce her moral accountability. The court delivered its sentence on July 1, 2025. 19 years in prison, backdated to 10 March 2022, with parole eligibility only after serving 10 years. This was not a portrayal of twitching madness. It was a portrait of a person cornered, grappling with addiction, isolation, ephemeral shelter, and undiminished emotional wounds. Her weapon was not chosen in rage. It was grabbed in a room filled with pain, alcohol, and a sense of betrayal. No dramatic moment preceded the attack. No loud argument, no crowd. Just two people, alone, tangled in a life that had quietly frayed until the weight snapped. Annette Hancock's story isn't framed by false innocence or sensational violence. It's one of everyday failure, of systems not providing enough, of relationships failing, of personal resilience running dry. She was a woman pushed beyond her limits, not demonized in court, but condemned for choices made in a moment too dark to escape. Annette Louise Ruth Hancock now serves her 19-year sentence at a Tasmanian women's correctional facility. She will only be eligible for parole after 10 years, a decade's time to reflect on a life unraveling behind closed doors. Some of these women wore masks of normalcy: mothers, grandmothers, neighbors, women who once shared quiet dinners, who sent holiday cards, who worked ordinary jobs. Others bore the signs of chaos long before their crimes ever made headlines. But in each case, beneath the surface, something darker had been building. A moment of fury, a long-held resentment, a calculated plan, or sometimes just complete emotional collapse. And perhaps that's what lingers most, the quiet horror of how ordinary the outside world saw them. Until it was far too late. Every case we've explored today is a reminder that danger doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it's soft-spoken. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it lives right next door. If this story left you thinking, tell us in the comments, which case shocked you the most? And where are you watching from? What time is it in your part of the world right now? Your comments help this channel reach more true crime lovers, and I read every single one. Make sure to subscribe for more deep, carefully told cases every single week. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next one, because some stories are too dark to forget. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.